repeatedly Israel is castigated for doing that. You even have that in the New Testament. You have in the parable of the Lord the importunate widow who comes to the judge, and the judge won't pay any attention to her. She wants justice. She wants that restored to her which was unjustly taken from her, and the judge won't have anything to do with her. He won't pay any attention to her. She's just a poor widow. And finally the Lord says, she bothered him so incessantly that finally, though he feared not God nor man, he did what the widow wanted just to get her out of his hair. And then the Lord compares that. Will not our Father in heaven hear us when we cry? But the fact that it's a parable shows that this was something very, very common in those times. You know how often yourself the poor are equated in Scripture with the oppressed and the afflicted. So I think that's the idea here in Job. Anyone else? All right, I want to underscore that for just a moment, though. Again, I'm not saying that when a person is in need, he should not come to the deacons. That certainly is the case. And he should come to the deacons because in coming to the deacons, he comes to Christ. And each of us must, in our need, go to Christ. We seek him, but it must not be forgotten that we seek Christ only because Christ first seeks us. That must never be forgotten. We cannot and will not seek Christ in our need, in our spiritual need, whatever that need may be, unless Christ first seeks us. You have that so beautifully expressed in Psalm 27, for example. Thou hast said, the psalmist says, Thou hast said, seek ye my face, and my heart did say, thy face, Lord, will I seek. But God says first, seek my face, and by the power of his word, we say, thy face, Lord, will we seek. Christ takes the initiative. Christ's grace and mercy and love are first. And it's my judgment that the deacons must also reflect this. Maybe it's true, as John points out, not only maybe, I think that it's very really a possibility that there are problems that arise, and the deacons have to be wise and discreet also in that. But nevertheless, because Christ takes the initiative in seeking out his poor people in all their needs and afflictions, the deacons must emulate that. You know, to be poor, and I think that needs underscoring, to be poor is not nice. There's a particular suffering, a particular affliction that is involved in being genuinely poor. And we have to bear that in mind. We have to bear that in mind, that especially we who have really never known what genuine poverty is, we have to bear in mind that poverty is a great affliction. And the people whom God makes poor suffer and are oftentimes ashamed and embarrassed and hesitant to reveal their poverty and hesitant to let others know that they are afflicted. And I think all those things the deacons must bear in mind. And in reflecting the sympathy and mercy of Christ in their office, they must remember that. They must remember that poverty is genuine suffering, and that it carries with it its own peculiar problems and temptations and sorrows, and they must follow in the footsteps of the one whom they serve. And remember that Christ seeks us in our misery, and so they must seek the poor in their misery. I don't mean to say that helter-skelter and willy-nilly you have to go all over the congregation asking, are you poor, are you poor, are you poor? I don't mean to say that. But I mean to say, nevertheless, that if the deacons have good reason to think that someone is in need, they must go to see them and seek them out, and maybe even encourage them to seek the help of the church, and explain to them why Christ has put the office of deacon in the church. It all comes down again, you see, to the fact that deacons reflect Christ's mercy, which is sovereign, which is free, which is first, which is the power whereby we seek him. Christ's mercy shown to us becomes in us the power whereby we seek him. The deacons, as reflecting that mercy of Christ and bringing the word of mercy, become the instruments in Christ's hand for the poor to seek Christ when there is a reluctance to do that. It all comes down to that question of mercy again, you see. So I think that there's no question about that in my mind.
Sure.
Yes.
I think though, poor congregation or, I would say poor congregation are stronger in spiritual, I think.
Oh yes, I have no doubt about that at all. All I'm emphasizing is that there is a particular suffering and a particular affliction that is involved in being poor for the one who is poor. But absolutely, what you say is true. The congregation with poor to care for is a congregation that is blessed. No question about that. All right, anyone else on that point? John?
When the deacons call on such an one that they feel might be in need, is it their responsibility to help them immediately, or is it they're calling first of all to work with either their parents or their children, whatever the case may be, to encourage them to help those that particular party?
Well, the responsibilities of the family, John, are always first. And I'm assuming that if there is a genuine need, that's where some person has a genuine need, is truly poor, is truly in need of the help of the church, that this is because there is no family to help them. I'm assuming in the church that families recognize the injunction of the scriptures in Timothy that they must help their own members of the family. If the deacons discover that that's not the case and that the family is not helping when it ought to help, then the deacons have to inquire into that, of course. That's first. It may be that the family didn't even know, of course, but if the deacons know, there's no reason to suppose that the family wouldn't. But no, it's always the family's responsibility first. So I assume that if there is a need, there is no family, or the family is in no position to help, and that's why the need exists. Anyone else on that? John?
I'd like to set up a hypothetical situation, which I think happened many times, or a few times in the past, and even recently where a church, say a church out west or so, sends out form letters to all other churches asking for help because their benevolent fund is expended. Now, wouldn't, as that congregation and that congregation being a family in itself, shouldn't that congregation or the deacons be obligated to make it known to their congregation that they have not sufficient funds, they are seeking out help from other churches? In other words, under the secrecy of that diaconate sometimes assume, they think that they must not make known that they're getting help from other churches or anything, and there may be wealthy families inside that church that are not even aware that the situation is critical and that they're seeking help elsewhere.
Well, you know, John, I know you run into problems sometimes, but I would assume if I was in a diaconate and I got a letter and the diaconate got a letter from a sister congregation for help, I would assume that that diaconate was seeking help from our diaconate because all means of raising additional funds within their own congregation have been exhausted. Their congregation is giving for the poor to the utmost of its ability. I would assume that. I wouldn't harbor in my mind the suspicion that another diaconate would seek the help of our diaconate if the money was readily available in their own congregation. In other words, as happens so often, if the benevolent fund is depleted, what the deacons do with the approval and consent of the elders is announced to the congregation itself. We have many poor to take care of, and the demands of the support of the poor are great, and we bring that to the attention of the people so that the people may know. And most of the time, especially in larger congregations, the people give abundantly to that sort of a thing. And I'm assuming, therefore, that if a diaconate seeks help elsewhere, it's because the burden of the poor is more than they can handle. I think you have to assume. You may have a small congregation, for example, in an area which is suddenly economically distressed, and half the congregation is out of work. And they have poor to take care of. And it's simply, for the time being, impossible for them to take care of the poor. Even after appealing to the people, they discover that this is the case. But I think in the Church of Christ you assume these things. You have to. Otherwise, what you're really saying is, that in a case like that, you're charging that diaconate of your sister congregation with not fulfilling its obligations before God, because part of its work is to see to it that monies are collected for the care of the poor. It's part of their work. And you're saying, really, in effect, to that diaconate, you're not doing your work. You've got to have some pretty good grounds to say that,
Well, the point I'm getting at is I think it has happened that diaconates that have plenty of money have said, we have surplus funds available, let us know if there's any further need. And these other diaconates would naturally tend toward saying, well, this is an easy way,
I don't know, John. I don't think you may say that.
Well, I think that you can, I could be sure that it has happened that the diaconate in an individual church had not let their people know to what extent they needed help, you know. They have rather just appealed to other churches.
Well, then all you can say is, if that's true, that diaconate is unfaithful in its work. That's all you can say. You know what the form says. The form says that it is part of the work of deacons to see to it that sufficient monies are collected from the congregation to care for the poor. That's part of their work. It's part of their office. And if they don't do that, they're unfaithful. They're unfaithful to their office. That's a serious business. And if I was ever going to charge a diaconate with that kind of unfaithfulness, boy, I tell you, I'd think a half a dozen times. That's like charging a minister with heresy.
But the point I'm getting at is, shouldn't it be the obligation of a diaconate to inform their congregation when they have to go outside their own congregation for help?
I don't think so. I think all they have to do is be sure that the congregation is incapable of giving any more money to benevolence. I think that's all they have to be sure of. And when at the point that they're sure that their own congregation cannot bring up any more money for benevolence, then they can go seek help elsewhere. But I think they may. I don't see anything wrong with it if they do, but I don't think they're under obligation to do that. I don't see why anyway, unless you can make that clear.
Well, to me, if I were a wealthy person in the congregation and I were given, maybe there was demands for $10,000 and I was given $5,000 myself, and figuring, well, that should be way more than enough, and the diaconate still don't have enough, they go appeal to other churches. Now, if I can support more and the need is not made known to me, then I would be innocent. But if the diaconate said, well, we still don't have enough, we're going to, if we don't receive more from our own congregation, we're going to have to appeal outside, then if I could and I didn't, then the responsibility would be on me.
Right, but you're always assuming, and that's what has to be assumed, that the diaconate tells the congregation, we have needs, this is the need, we're still not meeting the need, we need more yet. That's what you're assuming, and you have to assume that, that's right. To the point where even the diaconate in the past, as we noticed, has gone family to family in the congregation and told the people the needs and encouraged the people to give more. Not just simply bulletin announcements, not just simply a sermon from the pulpit, but has actually visited the members of the congregation to collect the alms. So I'm assuming that this is done, that the congregation is made fully and completely aware of the need. And if there's a rich man in the congregation, the deacons not only have the obligation to inform him that there's a need, but if they don't think he gives enough, to admonish him. They even have to go that far. But I'm assuming that all this is done. That's part of their work. And if they don't do that, then they're not fulfilling the duties of their calling in office. That's important. Okay, anyone else? Any other questions on 9 or 10? We can go on then to 10. Why do people find it difficult to go to the deacons for help? Are deacons themselves sometimes at fault for this? I think we're going to hurry along just a bit so that we can finish, and I'm going to make a few remarks about this. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. As I said already in connection with 10, I think that people sometimes do find it difficult to go to the deacons for help because there is in the minds sometimes of some of the people a certain shame in being poor, a certain embarrassment, a certain hesitancy to reveal their financial straits. And I think that's especially true in affluent times when the church as a whole is rather affluent and they are poor. They're ashamed and they are hesitant to go to the deacons for that reason. And that's why I say again, the deacons have a responsibility to go to them. We ourselves, you know, poor in the spiritual sense of the word, are sometimes ashamed to go to Christ. I'm sure that every child of God has that experience sometime in his life where he's so ashamed of his sin and so ashamed of his repeated sin that he's fearful even to go to Christ because of the shame of it all. And the word of Christ must come to him then, that Christ is our sympathetic high priest who understands and knows and will not turn us away from him when we come, no matter how often we sin against him. That same problem exists among the poor, and the deacons have the calling to go to the poor and comfort them and encourage them under those circumstances to seek Christ. Are the deacons themselves sometimes at fault for this? I hope not, although I can conceive of the possibility. I think if the deacons are at fault, it's because they conduct the office of deacons like a lending institution or a business and forget that they are office bearers in the Church of Christ, so that it becomes a business transaction and it becomes a financial planning institution of one sort or another. And I've warned you men before, don't ever get trapped into making the office of the deacons a business matter. It's an office of mercy. And I think if people are hesitant to come to the deacons because the deacons are at fault, that's probably the reason that the deacons make it a matter of business. If deacons are merciful, sympathetic, understanding of the needs of the poor, I don't think that the poor will ever hesitate to come. I don't think so. So that's my judgment on that. Anyone like to pursue that further? Bruce?
Isn't it also what I would call sinful human pride that the poor do not come to the deacons? But that actually, isn't every single one of us. That's the whole sin of Satan too, sinful pride. And I think we all have to guard against that, because looking at ourselves, if we were poor, our pride says, we're so good, and we don't want to be humble. Christ tells us to be humble. So it's something we all have to fight, even as office bearers.
Yes, there's no question about that. That stands connected too with what I said about the embarrassment and the shame of being poor. Pride gets in the way. Pride gets in the way of our coming to Christ. I think that's a point worth mentioning. I do. Yeah. Pride is a deadly sin. And if that is the case, I think that's, maybe you can even say that that's more true today than it used to be in times past. There's a spirit abroad in the land and in the church of independentism. I'll paddle my own canoe. I'll pull myself up out of my own bootstraps. I'll make my own way out of this. I don't need anybody else's help. It's a kind of a sad thing when it enters into the church. I remember, just as an illustration of this, it came to my attention once that there was a mother in the church who had a very busy family and who had a new baby in the home and who had had quite a difficult time with her baby, and who was therefore, when she returned to her home, quite weak, could not do her own work. So one of the mothers in the congregation, out of the goodness and kindness of her heart, went to this, one of the older women who didn't have children at home anymore, went to this young mother and said, "Why don't you let me help you? I'll clean your house for a couple of weeks, give it a good cleaning, and I'll take care of your laundry, and let me help you with your work." And that young mother said to her, "You think I want you snooping around in my stuff?" And that mother went away just devastated, of course, that older woman. And she said to me, "I'll never in all my life offer my services again." That's what she said. It's a shame, you know. That's a shame when that sort of a thing happens. We need each other in the Church of Christ. But there's that spirit of, I'll take care of my own problems. Keep your nose out of my business. I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps. That's a denial, ultimately, of the communion of the saints, where each in the church is there for the welfare of his fellow saints. You find that, too, in relationships sometimes of the poor to the deacons. You find that same spirit. That spirit has to be reprobated, has to be warned against, and has to be fought. When in the Church of Christ we no longer need each other, things have come to a terrible pass. That is for sure. So you're right. Anyone else? Gary.
I think, too, though, that sometimes, at least I get the feeling that they don't want to be a burden to the other saints. It's not always a matter of pride. I think sometimes it can be a matter that they feel it a burden. And I think that's partly because the deacons don't, maybe in their giving, point them to Christ, that they're receiving it from Christ, and that they're not a burden to the congregation, but that they're a blessing to them.
In a way, that's pride, though, too, isn't it? If they had an understanding of the Scriptures, then they would not talk that way. Maybe it's ignorance, but I suspect there's a little pride involved in that sort of an attitude, too. The ABCs, the basic principles of the communion of the saints, are certainly these, that we're in the church to help each other, and that a saint in need is not a burden. That's just simply the ABCs of the communion of the saints. Anyone else on these questions? All right, we're going to go then finally to the question of the relation of the deacons to government programs. And I'm going to make a few remarks about this. Not sure how long you want to discuss this. I think we could discuss this on and on, because this is one of the difficult problems which deacons face. So I'm going to try to draw a few lines, and then we're going to throw it open for discussion, and you can discuss it for a little while, and we'll see where we go. I'm going to be brief in what I have to say, so some of the things which I have to say you probably want to come back on. In the first place, the first thing I want to say, I'm going to stand up. I have trouble talking when I sit down. In the first place, I don't think there's any question about the fact that in a certain sense of the word, in a sinful world in which we live, the government itself has a responsibility to take care of the poor within the